Though theory is a necessary condition for the practice of history, it is not a sufficient condition. Indeed, Mises explains that to practice history we need something more. We need what is called Verstehen in German, or Comprensión in Spanish. We need understanding. The historian needs a special ability, a special art. It's not an exact science, by which he or she can decide what past events were most crucial, which elements most strongly influenced human behavior, etc. We call this ability understanding. So, history requires us to have both a prior theory and understanding. Understanding is a sort of knowledge historians gradually acquire with practice. It is knowledge about the importance of the different factors that influence human beings' behavior in all its richness, value judgments, etc. This explains why two historians who are equally well-educated, equally impartial, not biased by ideology, etc., and who share the same theory, may nevertheless present and interpret historical events differently. For it may be that they have a different understanding of the importance or weight of the specific factors which influenced each historical behavior they analyze. Understanding is like the wire that connects theory to events. In human action, I think Mises gives the example of Napoleon. One historian might say, when Napoleon decided to conquer Europe, he was motivated mainly by romantic ideals, by a desire to spread the principles of the French Revolution and of liberty throughout Europe. In contrast, another might say, no, it wasn't like that at all. In fact, he was a megalomaniac. He was a man driven by delusions of grandeur. And he may have had a complex because he was small. You know that when people are small, they usually have a complex. Anyway, that is what drove him to become a near criminal. Notice there are two approaches. One historian believes a certain valuation prevailed, while the other believes Napoleon made a different value judgment, that he was paranoid, etc. And so the two arrive at different interpretations, even when their underlying theory is the same, and they analyze the same facts. Therefore, understanding is the bridge that allows us to apply pure formal theory to the extremely complex world of past events. Now then, while theory always precedes history, and theory cannot be derived from history, an entire school of economists have maintained that history is all that matters, that we must study history, and that by analyzing many different cases and conducting historical studies, we could, by induction, arrive at theoretical knowledge. History would be equivalent to a physicist's laboratory. This is a very grave error, and it is one the German historicists, Schmoller and company, committed in the 19th century. Even today, a legion of positivist economists are still committing this error. They are being deceptive because there is no history you can understand without a prior theory. Those who believe they can derive theory from historical knowledge are surreptitiously under the table using conceptual theoretical frameworks that never come to the surface and are generally erroneous. First, we must develop a theory, and then we can get to work and research specific historical cases. While historical knowledge cannot provide us with theories, it can guide us towards the most pressing problems. It can tell us where our theoretical analysis is most urgently needed, or would be most relevant. So, for instance, I might develop an entire economic theory concerning a world where work takes no effort. But when I look around myself, and based on the theory I have, I interpret what I see. I realize that the principle of the disutility of labor applies to the vast majority of people. Other things being equal, working is hard for all of us. This is historical knowledge. For when I look around myself, and in light of the theory I have, I interpret concrete historical facts. I come to the conclusion that for most people it takes an effort to work, which is the principle of the disutility of labor. This realization tells me I should limit my theoretical analysis to those human actions in which it is clear that work entails a sacrifice for the people involved. I become aware that, for practical purposes, this is what matters. So, the history I am already able to interpret, based on my prior theory, guides me to the most crucial problems, the ones that most urgently require study, from a theoretical standpoint. Or maybe I look around myself and think, this is terrible. Financial markets have fallen. Banks have failed. There is a major economic recession. I can see that, so I'm going to focus my theoretical analysis on economic cycles. We can't derive theory from history, but history can often somehow direct the researcher toward the most urgent or weighty problems, those most deserving of his or her attention. Now, it would also be possible for an armchair theorist, to use Mises's term, to think about something and raise analytical problems connected with issues that haven't yet arisen in history. This is what I want to indicate with this arrow. Theories can be formulated about phenomena that have not yet occurred, but that can be considered important when, for some reason, a scholar, a pure theorist, sees these phenomena as potentially relevant in the near or distant future. How should I put it? It's as if, in the year 1911, Mises, thinking as a theorist, had reasoned in the following way, as in fact he did. What would happen if the gold standard disappeared? Something no one then thought was even conceivable. And the entire basis for the monetary system consisted of purely fiduciary paper currency. And as a result, governments and central banks manipulated the money supply by reducing interest rates. And so he imagined some events that had not occurred yet, but he felt they might be relevant. And he developed an entire theory of the cycle, which in fact did become extremely important 20, 30, 40 years later. At that time, it gained a prominence that was unthinkable when Mises began his analysis. This is the case of those scholars who develop theories without following the dictates of what is urgent, in terms of what they observe around them. Instead, they develop theories they believe may become relevant in the near or distant future, and that is what this arrow represents. At times, it has been said that the combination of theoretical and historical knowledge gives rise to what is called applied economics. Theoretical economics applied to studies of history in order to interpret events. Besides applied economics, this combination is also sometimes known as political economy. In fact, I hold a chair in political economy. If you read my books, for example, Money, Bank Credit and Economic Cycles, you will find them full of historical illustrations, because I apply theory to interpret reality, without ever committing the error of thinking theoretical knowledge can be derived from reality, when it's the other way round. We must always have a prior theory if we are to interpret what happens around us. The method of political economy is an essentially a prioristic and deductive method. What do I mean when I say the method of political economy is a prioristic? That is what the pyramid on the right side of the blackboard represents. I mean that we construct our discipline in the following way. We always begin with an axiom, an irreducible assumption. which is represented by the vertex at the top. We've already discussed this in class. We've said that the starting point, the irreducible assumption, which leaves room for no other in economic theory, is always the concept of human action. It is an irreducible assumption. It is self-evident. We cannot deny that the cornerstone on which the theoretical edifice of economics rests is human action without contradicting ourselves. In other words, if I deny that the starting point for the process of building the methodology of economics is human action, I am guilty of an unresolvable logical contradiction, for my denial is precisely a human action. My objective? To make a denial. My means? I launch into an explanation here, etc. I am acting. Furthermore, this concept is obvious to us not only in the sense that we cannot deny it without contradicting ourselves, in other words, it is axiomatic, but also because intimate experience through introspection shows each and every one of us human actors what action is, that it is the ultimate element, that there is none more fundamental, and we build our discipline upon it. This knowledge, which Mises describes beginning on page 64 of Human Action, is not only the starting point and the axiom, it is the theoretical cornerstone. In itself, it is theoretical knowledge, even if embryonic, in other words, incipient. And as theoretical, though perhaps very elementary knowledge, it enables us to interpret some of what goes on around us. It permits us, so to speak, to make a primary interpretation of historical reality. This is what I want to show. This theoretical knowledge, which is the preliminary axiom, allows us to interpret some, though a small part, of the history around us. In fact, the process by which our minds develop also provides an illustration. Many of us may have a little brother or sister. We start out as babies. Actually, in the beginning, a newborn is almost like a vegetable. But what a vegetable! A baby has a brain with 150 billion neurons in it, and she starts learning right away. After a few days, a few weeks, a few months, a baby has learned things. She begins by learning that if she cries, she is fed. A baby who doesn't cry isn't fed. So, wah, wah! Ah, they're feeding me. Or, they're giving me a bottle. We learn this immediately, and we all learned it as tiny babies. We start to develop knowledge when we are very young. We start to act very early, and this allows us to interpret things. What we first see as lights, we come to recognize as our mother. We can't do anything by ourselves. However, we are already interpreting some of what goes on around us, thanks to our prior, a priori, conceptual framework, which enables us to see the world. So, when we are small, we can already interpret some of the reality that surrounds us. Now, I'm going to carry out a more in-depth analysis of the human actions to which I suppose the principle of the disutility of labor applies. As we saw before, I believe this is the relevant focus in the historical world around me. So, the theorist continually selects, as it were, part of the historical reality he has been able to interpret in light of a prior theory, and he reintroduces this part in his analysis in the form of assumptions he considers potentially relevant. He reintroduces it in the form of assumptions, and through the corresponding chain of logical deductive reasoning, he arrives at more profound, more detailed economic or theoretical laws. These more profound or detailed economic laws are like a new pair of prescription glasses that are much more finely adjusted to the theorist's eyesight and permit him to interpret a much larger number of historical phenomena. That's why I've made this H larger than the one before. And from this history that surrounds the theorist, which his theory now enables him to interpret more broadly and in much greater detail, he can in turn select other assumptions he considers relevant and reintroduce them into the corresponding chain of logical deductive reasoning. to arrive at economic laws that are even broader and more profound, detailed and explanatory. These laws in turn will permit the theorist to present an even broader view of history, from which to derive assumptions he will reintroduce into the corresponding chain of logical deductive reasoning to arrive at yet broader and more detailed laws, and so on in a never-ending process of building economic science. We will do some of this together, because next week we will be studying individual human action, the action of one person alone. We will make an assumption. We will assume Robinson Crusoe is alone on his island. Friday hasn't even arrived yet. And we will study the principle of marginal utility for an isolated actor. That will permit us to interpret a larger part of historical reality, which will lead us to another assumption. We will assume he is not alone, but with other people. And we will follow our chain of logical deductive reasoning and formulate a theory of exchange and of prices. But when we formulate our theory of exchange and of prices, we will initially suppose the exchanges are direct, which is called bartering. That will enable us to interpret real phenomena. But we will note that in real life, people use money. So we will introduce money as a commonly and generally accepted medium of exchange, which will permit us to develop much more complex laws, the general theory of prices in monetary units. But then, with the introduction of money, we will see that money can be public or private. It can be manipulated or not. Its quantity can be increased or decreased, and it is related to the interest rate. We will make additional assumptions and develop an entire theory of economic cycles and capital, and so the process continues and becomes continually broader and richer. That is the a prioristic and deductive process. A prioristic, a priori, in the sense that economic science is always a priori. It is not derived a posteriori from knowledge of history, but instead it must exist prior to history. We begin with an axiom, and we gradually expand the laws which become increasingly complex through the corresponding chain of logical deductive reasoning, and the introduction of the theoretical assumptions we consider potentially relevant. Economic laws are universally valid. They are apodictic, if you will. They are valid anywhere in the universe at any moment in history, as long as the corresponding assumptions are met, of course. We cannot claim that certain economic laws held true in some historical circumstances, but not in others. No. The law that, other things being equal, any increase in demand tends to drive up the price is a universal law valid anywhere in the universe, at any moment in history. However, that law contains an assumption, other things being equal. I may consider a historical event. I don't know. Maybe I see that in Ireland at a certain time in history, the demand for potatoes increased greatly. And I look at the price of potatoes, and it turns out the price of potatoes did not rise, but fell. Well, the economic law is universally valid. All things being equal, any increase in demand tends to drive up the price. But here I see a historical event that seems to contradict that. I see that the demand rose, but the price dropped. What's going on? Is the law faulty? No, the law came first, and it is universally valid. If I study a specific historical event, and I see that though demand increased, prices did not rise, but instead they fell, then the assumptions are not met in that historical event. What may have happened to cause prices to drop even though demand rose? For example, a good crop may have led to an increase in supply that was more than proportional to the increase in demand. We know the law is universally valid, so if a certain historical event seems to point to contradictory conclusions, it is not that the law is incorrect. Instead, the law will direct us as historians in our search for the historical phenomena that kept the assumptions from being met. So, remember, all economic theories are universally valid. It is also traditionally said that the method of economic science is a method based on methodological individualism.
Menger
Menger wrote a methodological treatise called Investigations into the Method of the Social Sciences, with special reference to economics, in which he outlines his whole methodological position against the historicists. He used the term methodological atomism. I don't like it because it derives from the word atom, which is taken from the world of the natural sciences. What does methodological individualism mean? It means that we must be able to trace all construction of economic theory back to the action of human beings as individuals. In other words, individual human action is the starting point for everything, and it must be the basis for all the economic laws we construct or formulate together. We must always be able to trace them back to individual human action. Human beings are the central focus around which all economic science revolves. This is beautiful because it makes economics the quintessential humanistic science. Therefore, all the economic laws, or economic pseudo-laws, which in the future you study or read about or see commented on, that are based on aggregates or statistical concepts, laws you are not able to connect with individual human action, beep, 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 red alert! An alarm should sound, because they are most likely erroneous laws that have been formulated based on warped methodology and lead to harmful conclusions. As soon as professors fill up the blackboard with formulas that connect aggregate demand, the general price level, and multipliers, and you ask, but how is that connected with individual human action? And they answer, it's not connected with individual human action. These are concepts we statisticians and social engineers measure and manipulate. A red light should come on. They are violating the principle of methodological individualism. That is, when we construct our science, we must always be able to grasp the connection between the laws we have formulated and individual human action. In fact, there is a famous quote by Hayek. He says, "It is probably no exaggeration to say that every important advance in economic theory during the last 100 years was a further step in the consistent application of subjectivism." He was right, and indeed, it is when theorists violate the principle of methodological individualism that the gravest errors in our discipline arise. Positivism and social engineering are the great idols that indirectly provoked all the conflicts, genocide, etc. that devastated humanity in the 20th century. Therefore, it is my responsibility to express to you my criticism of positivism. You will find my criticism in my article, Método y crisis en la ciencia económica. Hayek refers to positivism as scientism. Please write down scientism. And he defines it as follows. He says that scientism is the indiscriminate and undue application of the method of the natural sciences to the field of economics and the social sciences, of human action. Why is there a desire to apply the method of physics and the natural sciences to the sphere of human action and economics, when it's now so obvious, in light of all we've said, that an abyss separates the world of human beings from the world of plants? Well, there are many reasons. Economists have always had an inferiority complex with respect to natural scientists. Economists have watched as bridges were built, man walked on the moon, and illnesses were eradicated. And it frustrates economists that they can't do the same. Be engineers of a sort, who with their knowledge and will, and with the power of the state, would solve every problem. So, dazzled by the illusion that copying the method of physicists would enable them to achieve the same results, economists insist on applying to their own field a method that is foreign to it, and the consequences for society are disastrous. Indeed, I repeat, all the conflicts, wars and genocide that have afflicted humanity, all you can imagine, have sprung from this methodological error. for ideas ultimately drive the world. Also, there is a social demand from citizens themselves who cry, "Papa State, solve my problems. From the time I'm born till they lay me in my grave, I want everything to be worked out for me." We rebel. We've talked about this in class already. We rebel against our own creative entrepreneurial nature. The uncertainty of the future makes us dizzy. We want guarantees, certainties, assurances. We turn our backs on our own nature. We demand and insist that social engineers sort out our lives. Notice what a vicious cycle that is. We rebel against our own nature. It's like when an organism has the most serious kind of disease an organism can have, when our immune system breaks down and our body's own defense system attacks our body. Such diseases are the most serious. Well, that also happens on a social level. We rebel against our creative nature, against the dizziness we feel at the uncertain future, and we demand someone organize our lives from above with coercive commands, which systematically conflicts with and ultimately destroys the process of social cooperation, as we will see in this course. Well, this has been a digression about the sociology of science, about why we again and again succumb to the crudest scientificism. According to Gregorio Marañón, who belonged to the Spanish Royal Academy, the appropriate term in Spanish is cientificismo, rather than scientismo. In my books I use scientismo. It's kind of a Hispanicized version of the word Hayek uses, scientism. Marañón defines scientificismo as both the belief that one has scientific expertise one does not have and the insistence on applying it. All who aspire to such an outrage are scientificistas, scientificists. Therefore, scientificism is the main manifestation of this positivism. Positivists defend what we will call methodological monism. Monism derives from the Greek monos, meaning single, alone. According to scientificists and positivists, there is only one scientific method, only one sole method, and it is applied equally, whether the field be physics, chemistry, the natural sciences, or the sciences of human action. They recognize no difference between human beings and bacteria, and therefore the same method that is applied in the laboratory to study a rock or a chemical compound, or to dissect a cadaver, must also be applied to human beings who act. That's what is called methodological monism. It collides with the proper perspective, which is based on methodological dualism, two radically different methods, one for the natural sciences and another for the social sciences. Not only do positivists and scientificists claim that there is no difference between the social and the natural sciences, and that the method used should be the same in both, but they also criticize axioms. They view all a prioristic axiomatic knowledge as metaphysics. Notice meta means beyond in Greek, so metaphysics means beyond physics. Positivists and scientificists see physics as the queen of the sciences, and because they consider it to be the quintessential science, they describe all axiomatic knowledge as metaphysics. In other words, unscientific, outside of science. I'm telling you this so you will be on your guard. Also, scientificists and positivists are generally determinists and materialists. Do you remember our pyramid, our hierarchical classification of orders? We talked about it yesterday or the day before yesterday. Well, scientificists and positivists believe that the simple orders determine the complex spiritual orders, that relationships flow from the bottom up, and not, as we were saying, from the top down. In fact, we criticized determinism. We said it could not be applied to itself, that the deterministic criterion could not be applied to determinists. If everything is determined, then your idea that everything is determined is itself determined, and therefore it lacks any scientific value. Furthermore, we said that the deterministic view is ultimately absurd, because we cannot possibly conceive of a world devoid of the principle of free will. How on earth could all our action be determined by nothing more than basic physical stimuli from the outside world? By what we have seen, by the light that has hit us, by what we have drunk, etc. I mention this because there is a battle raging here, a battle to the death. Either we are right or the others are right, and the implications for the process of social cooperation are very grave. Either it is true that human beings are like bacteria, that social engineers can manipulate society like Play-Doh, that one sole method, the same one, should be applied to physics, to technology, to engineering, as well as to society, and that the basic elements of the world of physics are what determine spiritual relationships and human action. Either the truth lies with that approach, or it lies with the correct approach, which I am explaining here, and which I defend. I hold that there is an enormous, essential difference between human beings and all other entities in the world of nature, that for some reason human beings are endowed with an innate creative capacity which makes their future uncertain, that historical events are extremely complex, because human creative capacity excludes constants, that we must have a prior theory, that this theory cannot be derived from real events. Therefore, methodological dualism is a requirement we cannot waive as social scientists. And scientism, positivism, and social engineering are very grave errors which have caused, and now cause, and always will cause the most catastrophic consequences in society, whenever the attempt is made to implement them. Whenever we wish to manipulate society from above, as if we were social engineers, we destroy the process of social cooperation. For the basic elements are not atoms, rocks, or organs, but precisely human beings endowed with an innate capacity for creativity. Karl Popper was an Austrian philosopher of science and a friend of Hayek's. Popper's thinking changed over time, and he passed away in 1994. I had the pleasure of meeting him and having some contact with him. To tell you the truth, though Popper is considered a great liberal, a great critic of positivism, we mustn't kid ourselves. The thing is, he attacked the most extreme positivists, but he remained a positivist himself. Popper never clearly grasped that the fundamental difference between the world of the social sciences and the world of the natural sciences calls for a different method. Popper remained a positivist, and the principle that has gained acceptance among positivists and scientificists who seek a procedure for determining if their theoretical laws are valid or sound is a demarcation principle put forward by Popper. The principle can be explained as follows. The natural scientist begins with a hypothesis, something he believes may happen. Then he goes to the real world, through a laboratory experiment, etc., to see if the real world is consistent with his hypothesis. If the real world is consistent with his hypothesis, then he accepts the hypothesis, but tentatively. This idea of tentativeness is typical of Popper, and it's one of the least harmful ones. In short, if it seems to me that my hypothesis is confirmed in the real world around me, in the laboratory experiment, then I accept my hypothesis, my law, and I consider it valid. But, and this is important, only tentatively. I do not rule out the possibility that in the future another lab experiment, another discovery, etc. may refute my hypothesis, because it is inconsistent with new findings. If my hypothesis is inconsistent with new findings, I consider it refuted. This possibility of consulting the real world to see if it is consistent with a hypothesis or instead refutes it is what methodologists call the falsifiability of a hypothesis. That's a mouthful, isn't it? If a hypothesis is falsifiable, then it is possible to look to real events to see if the hypothesis is consistent with reality. And if it is, then the hypothesis is accepted as valid, but only tentatively. If it is not consistent with reality, the hypothesis is not accepted. This is called the falsifiability criterion, and it is what would determine whether or not a hypothesis is scientific. Therefore, only falsifiable hypotheses, only hypotheses that can be tested in the real world to see if the real world validates them or not, are considered scientific. So, those hypotheses that are not falsifiable are considered unscientific.
No son científicas. Y la falsación,
Falsification consists precisely of empirical testing.
empírica, es decir,
That is, of seeing if real events confirm the hypothesis or not. This is the criterion of scientific validity all positivists adopt. It is the demarcation criterion for determining which hypotheses are scientific, only the falsifiable ones according to Popper, and falsification consists of empirical testing. In other words, falsification involves consulting reality to see if it is consistent with the hypothesis or not.
este es el Popper de los años.
This is the Popper of the 1930s. Popper passed away at the end of the last century, at the age of 90, and as he grew older he became more and more Austrian. When he died, he was practically one of us.
Era de los nuestros. Pero lo malo,
Unfortunately, the seed he planted when he was young is the one that spread throughout the world, and the scientificists used it. This procedure is still given preeminence, and that is why I explain
por
it.
eso lo explico. Bueno, pues lo que vamos a hacer ahora
But
es
now we're going to criticize positivism. We're going to criticize this procedure, and we will begin by criticizing its application to the world of the natural sciences. We will see that this procedure makes no sense, even in the natural sciences. And next Tuesday, we'll find it a very easy task indeed to show it makes no sense in economics.
faena de lo más facilona. Vamos a ver,
So, our criticism of positivism is as follows. Positivists are guilty of two insoluble logical contradictions.
primero,
First, the criteria of verification or falsification, like the one I have just explained, are not verifiable or falsifiable in themselves. Therefore, according to Popper's own framework, since none of this is falsifiable, since we can't look to real events to see if the only scientific hypotheses are those that can be falsified based on real events, since this principle is itself completely unfalsifiable, then according to positivists themselves, it's metaphysical. That is, invalid, simply pulled out of a hat. Do you remember how we threw determinism back at determinists? Well, now I'm throwing the principle of falsification back at positivists. Hey, buddy, explain your own principle to yourself. Can you look to real events to see if only falsifiable hypotheses are scientific? No. Then according to you yourself, I didn't say it, everything you've said is pure metaphysics and of no scientific value.
pero es que además, para
Second, and furthermore, to falsify a supposedly scientific proposition or a hypothesis, we must go to the real world, to see if real events validate or refute the hypothesis. And that requires us to make sense of the real world, to understand it.
entender la realidad. Y no hay
And there is no way we can possibly understand the real world if we don't already have a theoretical hypothesis that is
que sea
true.
cierta ya. Luego, a ver,
So, I'd like to see you solve that problem.
este problemón. Pero
But let's leave natural scientists and their methodological problems alone. It's up to them how they deal with them.
nosotros somos economistas.
We are economists and social scientists, and from the perspective of social science, there are 4 further reasons it is impossible to apply this framework of scientific validation in our discipline.
Esquema de validación
We'll discuss them next Tuesday.
y que veremos el próximo martes.